I'm Natalia Kucirkova, it's Slovakian surname, and I'm currently based at UCL Institute of Education. And I'm really pleased to have such an eclectic audience because I locate my work in several disciplines. So I work at the intersection of human-computer interaction, developmental psychology, and education. And I'm inspired by people who work in these different fields. So when it comes to psychology, I very much draw on Lev Vygotsky's theory, sociocultural theory. I don't need to introduce him to you. When it comes to education as well as psychology, Jerome Bruner's work and the power of narratives as the key organizing device for human thinking. In human-computer interaction, I'm very inspired by Alison Drouin's work and the notion of participatory research and how can we include children in the work that we produce. I work with designers quite closely as well. I think some of you mentioned that you work with designers, and it's so enriching to have children's perspectives and treating them as co-researchers in the work that we do. And then I draw a lot on Louise Moll's work in Funds of Knowledge. How many of you are familiar with that work? Not many. Okay, so I think I would locate it more at the education intersection, and it's mostly to do with the notion of all children having some funds of knowledge that they can bring to the classroom and to the formal learning environments where they're educated, and asking really important questions about how can we honor and how can we celebrate the funds of knowledge that all children have. So this amalgam of different theories made me think about digital technologies as socio-material entanglements. And what I mean by that is that, and I might upset some people, especially those who compare digital versus paper-based resources, for example. I really see them as socio-material entanglements that cannot really be discussed without paying attention to the context of interaction, to the content that is on these devices and the individual child. So I'll be drawing on the social and the material aspects of books that I'll be discussing today in relation to personalization. If you want more of a theoretical rather than a visual perspective on what I just said, is thinking about bringing together intersubjectivity into the design of technologies. And I know it does sound a bit complex, but when it comes to thinking about children's reading for pleasure, which is very much my area, literacy, young children's literacy and development of reading, we need to think about their engagement with the book. And what I mean by that is thinking about some facets of engagement that run across digital print-based materials and that have been around in the literature for a long time. And I'm asking questions together with my colleagues, how can we theorize these different facets of engagement and how do they become foregrounded in the digital context? We can actually map these different types of engagements on the so-called 4 Ps of digital childhoods. So Professor Anna Kraft thought about the ways that 21st century globalized childhood is developing. And if you look at the creativity, the shared engagement, sustained engagement, personalized, interactive, and affective, you can map them quite nicely on the 4 Ps of possibility, awareness, playfulness, pluralization, and participation. And I'll be talking about personalization at the intersection of pluralization. So I really don't want to think about personalization at the expense of diversity and the plural notion of childhood. This might sound a bit theory heavy, but it's actually something that I feel very strongly about in terms of trying to convey to the practitioners and stakeholders we work with. So in the UK, we've got a Digital Book Award that is an award judged by teachers. And in that award, we use these criteria I've just shown you, so these different types of engagement. We also have a literacy apps website that is for parents, teachers who are looking for high-quality apps for young children. And here again, we use the same criteria, but in a different language, if you like, but really trying to convey the notion of complexity and the importance of the design, the material, together with the social. Please.
What age do these apps usually start at?
Very good question. So literacy apps is 0 to 5, and UKLA Digital Book Award is 2 till 8-year-olds. And my work is, I would say, 2 to 8-year-olds. Cool. Yeah. So personalization. I'm so glad that many of you are here, and I hope that we can discuss this when I finish talking, because I'm currently working on a book about personalization in the 21st century, as well as having a bit of a historic look at what has been happening. So really keen to hear your thoughts on this. But when I wrote about personalization before, this is how I defined it, as a nexus of practices, products, and processes. And you would be familiar with personalized news, you would be familiar with personalized services, such as getting your holiday package personalized to your own taste, for example, as well as personalized resources. So some of you mentioned robotics and working on specific toys, specific objects that are personalized to a single human being. Now, when we talk about education, personalized education and standardized education are often juxtaposed and treated in dichotomy. And when we talk about industry, it's the notion of generic product versus a bespoke, personalized product that is, it usually carries a higher price tag. Are people familiar with the distinction between personalization and customization? Not many. So in a nutshell, customization is about adjusting the content to a group of people. So you can have, for example, customized resources would be books for boys or books for girls or for specific age groups or group of people, whereas personalized is really for a specific individual. So I now zoom in on the micro influences. So this is a bit of an overview of a macro influence, if you like. And personalized books is a very specific resource when it comes to personalization. And I'll start with the material, because it's quite interesting when you look across, and this draws on a systematic review of most popular children's digital books. We looked at the different kinds of characteristics that can be personalized in these different books. And we also look at print-based picture books. And what you find is that the textual personalization, this is how it really started. It used to be very basic. So you would have your name, your favorite food, perhaps the names of your friends inserted into a generic template. And that was the kind of personalized book that used to be very popular. But now it's getting more and more sophisticated. So I don't know how many of you know Lost My Name? Many of you, right? So they really turned this into a successful business model where you are using different templates to create different books for different children. So in this case, different names. You essentially use a child's name to construct a specific story plot. Visual personalization. Now in print books, like for your baby, you might have a nice book where at the end there's a little mirror and the child can see her face. Similarly, in digital books, you can make faces, you can see your own face because you can switch on the front-facing camera. You can also make these permanent, so you can take a picture and keep it inside the book, which of course is different from the print version. Visual personalization in digital books is very interesting when you think about what I said at the beginning in terms of narrative and Jerome Bruner's notion of how important stories are for our meaning making. So here you've got the classic fairy tale Cinderella, but the child's face is part of the story because it can appear in the magic mirror. So it really changes children's perception about what is happening in the book when they can suddenly see their own face inside the story. I mentioned customization, and some of you might be familiar with the Montgomery Choose Your Own Adventure stories, where you could go from, one book to another book and from one page to another page. So you would essentially customize your own story ending. In digital books, you could potentially have limitless number of options in terms of how the story finishes. And it's also interesting to note that this is Nosy Crow's very popular Obliterate Riding Hood. Come in. Based again on a classic fairy tale, but what's interesting about it is that the child can choose how the story finishes. So the child can choose the path of feathers or the path of bees. So there are different options of how the literate defeats the wolf at the end. And that, of course, leads to a lot of repeated interactions. It certainly contributes to children's preference for the book. And then audio personalization. So I explained the textual, the visual, and audio is like the third mode in which you can personalize digital books. And what happens here is that you can audio record your own voice to accompany classic stories. So this is very attractive to parents who, for example, can't be with their child in the evening, but they can audio record their version of the story, and then the child can listen back to it. So when we look at what we know from research, and these are small-scale studies, so it's not that we would have longitudinal analysis or even cross-sectional analysis. So really a major caveat when I'm drawing on research and saying this is empirical evidence. This is the little evidence that we have. When we compared personalized books versus non-personalized books, we did see that presumably the motivation factor, perhaps the attention to the story that is about a child, did lead to children's greater acquisition of new words. So they learned more new words in the personalized than the non-personalized condition. This was a structured experiment drawing on developmental psychology. We also saw that when we compare the language that children produce when they are reading these personalized books, it's more self-referential. So essentially they were saying me, most of the time. Which is not surprising, right? This is what is happening when we personalize the resources for young children. The response we get is that they are in their own little world.
Can I ask you? You went through a number of different ways one can personalize. Are these results kind of across those or specific to any particular ones?
Excellent question, thank you. This is based on a study that used visual and textual personalization together in one book. So we had children's pictures as well as the names of their friends, their own name, of course, and their favorite food. So textual and visual personalization combined. And that was matched with non-personalized information. I mentioned at the beginning that I understand children's engagement with technologies in terms of socio-material entanglements. I described the material features and now moving to the social features of personalization. And I'm talking about personalization, so I need to make this personal as well. So this is me reading books when I was a young child, and my grandfather used to read with me. And when I'm thinking about this really fond memory of my own childhood, I remember that we were reading books, and the reason why I really loved these wonderful interactions I had with my grandfather was not about the book, it was about how he made the book relevant to my own life. So he would encourage me to read for him, even though I couldn't read, so there were just pictures and I could basically make up my own story. Or he would mention different things on the page that he knew I experienced before. So he was personalizing a generic text for his granddaughter. So what we know from literature on decontextualized talk, and I don't know how many of you work in developmental psychology or even education, but this is quite a big field when it comes to shared book reading and reading with young children, how important it is for adults to be linking the content to the child's life. You are nodding, you're familiar with this.
I'm a mom.
You're a mom, so you know it from the practical perspective. But many people forget how important it is, that we focus on the text rather than what is happening around the text. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes I find it hard to understand why people would compare print versus digital without looking at these underlying issues, these really enduring facets that run across different types of media. And distancing talk is actually one of them. So in the most recent study by Brenna Hassinger-Das, she just presented another paper at AERA conference in New York last week. They compared print books versus digital books in terms of child story comprehension. And what they found was that the different condition in terms of the different medium didn't really make a difference to the child story comprehension. It was the amount of the parents' distancing talk that made a difference to how the child understood the story. So a really important aspect when it comes to children's outcomes and what we focus on.
What do you mean by distancing?
Oh, it's what I described in terms of being able to relate the content to the child's life. There are different names for it. Distancing talk, decontextualized language, even what was the referencing. So that will be like another way of describing. So there isn't really unified vocabulary for it, if you like. But these will be like the different terms that are being used for the same thing, the parent drawing on the child's life and linking it to the book. A quick summary of what we do know when it comes to reading personalized books and looking at this social aspect of it. First of all, we found that when the book is personalized, the parent-child interaction around the book is very positive. Now, you might think, well, common sense, the book is about the child, the parent loves the child loves seeing herself in the book, so there'll be a lot of positive interaction. But it's actually quite an important message to send to, for example, developers of digital media for young children, because very often we see them being designed for independent interaction or interaction that doesn't necessarily invite the parent to the interaction. So it's really important that we do include some personalization features so that there can be this dialogue around the book and there can be this positive, happy atmosphere as we described it in one of the studies. It also supports this, I would say, less hierarchical parent-child interaction. So because the child feels more empowered in the experience, in the sense that they can see that the book is about them and they remember the specific event that they experienced, we notice much more of a really positive parent-child exchanges in terms of how much the child talked in the book reading session. Now, we didn't in this specific study compare it with non-personalized books, so it's very likely that it might be happening similarly with the non-personalized book, but possibly less about the child's own life. And the third study I want to draw your attention to is really important when we think about design. So teachers versus designers' perspectives when it comes to digital personalized books. And that's the most recent study that we published out of this project that I'm leading this year at UCL on personalized books. And I just want to tell you a little bit more about this study because I think it's very important we recognize the discrepancy when it comes to what designers think about personalization and what teachers think about personalization. So designers were describing personalized books in terms of giving parents superpowers and creating a magical experience for the child. And these were the different benefits that they mentioned. However, the teachers, I mean, you can see the comments on top of the slide. they were really concerned, and they would not allow these kinds of resources to be in their classrooms. So, actively opposed to introducing personalized and digital personalized books to formal learning environments.
Can you say more about how you gather that data from the teachers?
Sure, these were focus groups interviews. So when you, this is now open access, it's the last article if you want to see the exact methodology, but these were focus group interviews with teachers and with designers. So basically we showed them some examples, and then we had a focus group interview type of interaction. So they told us what they believed, basically. Not an intervention.
Okay.
Just asking their views and perspectives. So I'm now introducing the third stakeholder, if you like, to the equation. So the designers and the app developers, and how do they perceive personalization, as well as publishers. So remember, I understand personalization to be running across print books and digital books. So it's really these three different types of commercial developers, designers, app developers, and children's book publishers. Now for them, of course, it's not only the possibility to launch different titles in different versions, but it's also the access to children's data and being able to track how different children interact with these books over time, being able to store and archive children's data and then develop specific products for these children. And these are just a few examples of really growing industry movement in terms of personalization. The amount and the type of personalization is changing very rapidly and dynamically. Lost My Name is now called Wonderbly, and they produce a suite of different personalized books. In this one, for example, you have a picture of your front door at the end of the story. So, it's becoming mixed in terms of the different types of personalization as well. So the visual coming together with the textual, for example. And I think it's really important we start asking these important questions in terms of how much is it really personalized, how much is it more about programming children's reading in a certain way that we know will be motivational for them and will be interesting for them. How much is this about prescriptive or participatory model of reading? Of course, we need to be aware of the fact that this is part of the changing landscape of book reading overall, and there are many different trends that I'm certainly aware of when it comes to harnessing children's data for commercialization purposes. And for those of you who are interested in this aspect, and I know there might be some differences in terms of the US law and the European law, but in the UK we've got the GDPR now, the General Data Protection Regulation. So we looked at the implications of GDPR for personalized books. So that's the latest paper that is freely accessible from UCL as well. Now, I wrote about this quite a while ago, that when it comes to the design, we need to think about the synergy between the practitioner, the designer, and the researcher working together. Whether that really has changed over the past few years, I can't really see much progress. There's a lot of development happening in isolation from educational researchers and indeed educational practitioners. It's often we develop something, then we test it very quickly in the classroom, we launch it on the market, and we learn from the mistakes. I do understand that it's difficult. I have been centrally involved in developing these 3 products for young children, and I know how difficult it is to produce something that guarantees return on investment, that children find amusing, interesting, and at the same time parents and teachers value. So I do know that it's challenging and it's not easy. But what these different products taught me, I would say, is that when it comes to personalization, agency is really, really important. And this is again going back to more of my theoretical work and theoretical thinking on personalization. But you can see how I locate agency in terms of autonomy, attachment and aesthetics, as well as authorship and authenticity that we try to nurture when we personalize products for young children. If we focus on agency, then we can achieve some really interesting things that I believe are more community-oriented. I'll focus mostly on the child, and the last few slides will be just to wrap up some of my recent work on this, because I'm really keen to hear about your work and your thoughts on this. But if we focus on agency and position children as authors, then we can think about our story, the app that we developed at the Open University, in terms of children creating their own stories, children sharing their own stories with adults because they can print them and have them as evidence in schools, but also have them at home in terms of their own personal stories. We can really celebrate the child's voice and capture their own stories, their own personal stories. And this is going back to the Funds of Knowledge framework that I mentioned at the beginning. Just a quick slide that these were the different studies we did, focused really on the notion of child as author of different digital books, and also children as story makers and story designers. We can also think about how we can foster more of a community engagement when it comes to agency, because it's not only children's agency, but it's also agency of the different audiences that they interact with. So we had teachers creating stories with the young children. We have elderly members of community sharing their stories and co-creating digital books about their own memories. That's the last project, thinking about Second World War and what the people could remember about the war, and then sharing it as part of their digital stories. So what I'm thinking about right now is more about the pedagogical principles. So how can we ensure that agency in terms of the digital medium can be fostered, not at the expense of empowerment and not at the expense of teachers' competence. So thinking about how can we link the gap that seems to exist between designers and teachers. So I'll just leave it here, because this is kind of a quick visual and theoretical summary of what I'm thinking about with my colleagues in terms of where can we locate personalization. And I mentioned Vygotsky at the beginning and the sociocultural framework, so you would be familiar with the zone of proximal development. So IDZ, which is in the fourth quadrant, is thinking about linking these different things together. So thinking about the acts and the sharing the intersubjective and intrasubjective together. And again, if you're interested in reading more about it, it's an open access article. So I've got some questions for discussion and sharing my thoughts on this, because we are just about to start a new big project in the UK that will be looking at personalization and how can we make sure that it's aligned with these complex ideas, but at the same time can actually deliver specific products for young children. And these are some of the dilemmas and some of the questions that I'm asking in terms of design and pedagogy. And thank you. These are my contact details in case you want to get in touch. But yeah, I'll leave it at these questions so that we can discuss them together.
Yeah, thank you so much.